The underworld of organized crime is a place defined by secret operations and power struggles. Many gang leaders throughout history have shaped the way organized crime is run today. This includes some of the most influential black mafia figures. From the way Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson used organized crime to help his community to Kenneth McGriff's alleged rivalry with 50 Cent, there are many stories that shape mafia history. In today's video, we're going to cover 10 of the most notorious black mafia figures in history. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. During his era, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was one of the most feared crime bosses in Harlem. He was a fighter from a young age. People started calling him Bumpy as a kid because he was born with a deformity on his head. Kids would pick on him at school, but instead of being their punching bag, he fought back. It didn't take long for the kids at school to realize Bumpy wasn't the one to mess with. But he eventually dropped out of school and started working odd jobs. He ended up catching the attention of William "Bub" Hewlett after a confrontation on Bub's storefront. Instead of holding a grudge against the kid, Bub admired how he refused to back down, so he offered him a job as a bodyguard for high-profile bankers. Many people around Harlem wanted Bumpy for protection, but as his reputation as bodyguard was flourishing, so was his criminal lifestyle. Bumpy was getting involved in extortion, robberies, and even started working as a pimp. At this stage in his life, he wasn't the savvy criminal he would grow to become, so he ended up getting arrested and spent a good chunk of his 20s behind bars. Once he was released from prison, he ended up connecting with Stephanie St. Clair. She was the leader of a local gang in Harlem and got involved in several criminal organizations. She also saw a lot of potential in Bumpy, realizing that he could be her perfect partner for organized crime. He pulled off many illegal operations for her, some of them included murder. When she eventually went to prison, Bumpy became the godfather of Harlem. Those who were on his bad side would experience his wrath of terror. He could be brutal and violent, especially when it came to his rivals. One of his rivals allegedly got cut 36 times by Bumpy's switchblade in one street fight. He could be a bad man when he needed to be, but he also had a heart of gold. He loved the community of Harlem and would go out of his way to help those in need. He used his money from organized crime to help communities in poverty. Bumpy had a reputation for sending food and gifts to people in the local community. One of the things that captivates us about Bumpy's legacy is that he was always committed to rehabilitating the community he lived in. He ruled with an iron fist and gave back with a generous heart. Guy Fisher. In the 1970s and early 1980s, a crime syndicate called the Council dominated the streets of Harlem. They were involved in many illegal activities, but were most notorious for their control of the heroin trade. Kingpin Nikki Barnes led this group. Guy Fisher got involved in organized crime in his early 20s. He became very influential in the heroin trade and the crime group. In the mid-1970s, the Apollo Theater shut down. This theater played a big role in the growth of black music, so people in the community were devastated that it was gone. However, Guy was able to bring happiness back to the community when he acquired the Apollo Theater and reopened it. He also became the first black man to own it. That being said, at the time of his acquisition, media reports were very secretive about who the owner was. After all, they didn't want to admit a heroin kingpin was running the place blatantly. Guy Fisher did have a lot of influence, but only for a short period of time. Authorities were cracking down on the council. Nikki Barnes had already been brought in. He made a move that broke all mafia code. He became an informant and ratted on the rest of the council. By 1984, Guy Fisher was convicted of several criminal offenses, including drug trafficking and murder. Guy was released from prison in October of 2020, serving over 30 years. It was reported that he was released because of COVID-19 restrictions and his failing health. While he was in prison, he earned a master's degree and a PhD in sociology. Frank Lucas. Frank Lucas is known as the American Gangster. His reputation even inspired the movie American Gangster with Denzel Washington. But there's a fine line between what parts of his legacy are true and what has been fabricated for entertainment. What we do know about Frank Lucas is that he was raised in North Carolina, but he fled to New York after a violent confrontation with his boss at a pipe company. Once he was in New York, he realized there were more opportunities to make money from crime. Eventually, he caught the attention of Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy acted as a mentor to the young Frank. He taught him everything he knew about the heroin trade and criminal underworld. The scholar took everything he learned and brought it to the next level. One of his most notorious acts was how he smuggled blue magic heroin into the US. Now, this is one of the strongest forms of the drug, at 98% pure heroin. Allegedly, Frank arranged to have the blue magic smuggled in using the coffins of dead soldiers returning to the U.S. Frank was running a heroin operation that would have made Bumpy proud. As good as this gangster was, he had one significant flaw. He wanted to be rich more than anything in the world, and he didn't want to be a subtle type of rich where he personally enjoyed his lap of luxury. No, he wanted everyone to know how wealthy he was. This desire is what ultimately brought his empire down. He was able to afford some of the best seats at a Muhammad Ali boxing match. We're talking about seats that were better than the A-list celebrities were booking. If that wasn't good enough, he also wore a $100,000 chinchilla fur coat to the event. People were questioning who this man was. He wasn't a known celebrity or business owner. Authorities noticed him right away and started building an investigation against him. He was arrested in 1975 and his assets were seized. He was initially sentenced to 70 years in prison, but he became an informant and helped the DEA with over 100 drug convictions. This allowed him to go on parole in 1991 with protection. Nikki Barnes. We mentioned Nikki Barnes earlier as we talked about Guy Fisher. This is the man who ran the council. He was deeply involved in the heroin trade throughout Harlem. He was also nicknamed Mr. Untouchable. As a New York Times magazine cover once wrote, "This is Nikki Barnes. The police say he might be Harlem's biggest drug dealer, but can they prove it?" It's hard to say if the police stepped up their initiatives because they were embarrassed by the magazine cover or if they were already close to catching him. Either way, Nikki was soon caught and brought into custody. During his criminal era, Nikki was known for his resourcefulness. He was always able to conduct a new business venture to keep the money coming in. Before the heroin trade, he would pull off street crimes like burglary and car theft. He was also a mastermind when it came to getting away with his crimes. Authorities would gather evidence against him only for it to vanish. In some cases, witnesses would even vanish. If a witness didn't vanish, you can guarantee their memory of what they saw did. However, after that New York Times magazine cover, the police were too close for Nikki's comfort. He knew that this time he didn't have a way out, but when he was behind bars, he discovered that his wife, mistresses, and associates were burning through his wealth. Allegedly, he was furious, so he decided to turn against them by working with the police. He testified against his former associates and his wife, sending them all to prison. Larry Hoover. Larry Hoover was no stranger to the life of crime. At the young age of 13, he joined a street gang called the Supreme Gangsters. He started off with petty street crimes like theft, but as he spent more time with the gang, he got involved in violent assaults and murders. He became a loyal member and worked his way up the ranks. Eventually, he connected with David Barksdale, a leader of a rival gang. The two joined forces and brought their two gangs together, calling the crew the Black Gangster Disciple Nation. David succumbed to an injury, leaving Larry Hoover to run the gang on his own. At this point, the gang had full control of the South Side drug trade. However, in 1973, things got out of hand for the kingpin. He was charged with the murder of a rival drug dealer and was looking at 100 to 150 years in prison. Behind bars, Larry proved just as influential as he was on the outside. Prisoners respected him and listened to him. The police used this to their advantage. They used Larry's influence to prevent riots and other uproars from happening. There were also rumors that Larry was living a lavish life behind bars. Apparently, he had access to new clothing, special meals, and private visits from friends and family. However, it was discovered that he was still running the gang from behind bars. In order to make himself look good and possibly avoid prison, Larry had previously started some nonprofit charity organizations. This didn't keep him out of prison. To make things worse, it was later discovered that the nonprofits were just fronts for illegal activities. This added more time to his sentence. Albert Elpo Martinez. Albert Elpo Martinez was a notorious figure in the New York drug scene. He first got involved with selling drugs at the age of 13. It didn't take him long to make a reputation for himself in this world. He was always chasing the next thrill and made a lot of money along the way. The young drug pin also had a violent streak. He used killing as a means to get what he wanted. For most murders, he enlisted the help of hitmen, but he wasn't afraid to take on the challenge himself. Allegedly, he killed his former business partner, Richard Porter, after being cut out of some deals. As Elpo began to expand his business across the nation, authorities were able to zone in on him. He was arrested for drug trafficking charges, but like other criminals in our video today, he decided to work along with the police as an informant. He played a role in bringing down many people who he once considered a friend. He was released from prison in 2015, but rumor has it Elpo didn't stay away from the drug trade. When he was killed in 2021, authorities first thought he could have been killed by a rival over a drug deal gone wrong. They later discovered he was killed by Shaquem Parker, a motorcyclist who Elpo had struck earlier. Kenneth Supreme McGriff. Kenneth Supreme McGriff was a notorious drug kingpin. He ran a crew called the Supreme Team that took control of the crack cocaine distribution scene in Queens. He has a long list of criminal activities and was in and out of prison. But what's most notorious about this gangster is his celebrity encounters. After being released from prison in 1995, Kenneth had plans to break into the entertainment industry. In his pursuit, he became friends with hip-hop music producer Irv Gotti and some of his talent. He became familiar with many upcoming rappers. In 2000, he was asked to settle a dispute between 50 Cent and Ja Rule. Allegedly, 50 Cent was making a lot of threats and he refused to back down. Now, 50 Cent has a reputation for being petty. No matter how many times someone threatens him, he will always bite back publicly. He decided to release a song called Ghetto Koran, where he mocked Kenneth McGriff. Not long after the release of this song, unknown attackers shot 50 Cent 9 times. At this point in time, there was no evidence that Kenneth was responsible, but 50 did release another song that pointed fingers at him. A year later, Kenneth's violent tactics caught up to him. 2 rival gangsters, E-Money Bags and Singleton, were found murdered in Queens. With these murders, police were able to gather enough evidence to bring Kenneth McGriff back to prison. Jeff Fort. Jeff Fort grew up in a low-income household in Chicago. He dropped out of school in the 9th grade and was frequently getting into trouble with the police. When he was in juvenile detention, he connected with another inmate, Eugene Bull Hairston. The two formed a gang called the Blackstone Rangers. They ended up growing the gang to have nearly 5,000 members. When Eugene was imprisoned in 1966, Jeff Fort took full control. He renamed the group the Black P Stones. His criminal activities with the gang began to expand. They were involved in drug trafficking, robberies, and extortion. The gang would use violent tactics to get what they wanted. People began to fear the wrath of Jeff Fort. After being accused of embezzlement, Jeff Fort was put behind bars. This is when he converted to Islam and started going by Chief Prince Malik. When he was released from prison, he renamed the gang El Rukn. The gang continued working in the criminal underworld. A few years after being released, he was arrested again for drug charges, but the investigation uncovered something deeper. Authorities discovered he was working with the Libyan government on a plot to carry out terrorist acts against the U.S. He was sentenced to 80 years in prison for this plot. Stanley Tuki Williams. Growing up, Stanley Tuki Williams didn't have the same idols as his peers. While other young boys were looking up to athletes and superheroes, Tuki idolized criminals. He rarely went to class and was convinced that he would excel at a life on the streets, not sitting behind a desk. Tuki was a fighter. This caused him to make several enemies and friends throughout his journey. One friend that he met was Raymond Washington. The two ended up forming a Los Angeles street gang called the Crips. They were initially formed to protect the neighborhood from rival gangs, but it ultimately became something bigger. The gang was known for violence, with Tuki being one of the key figures to pull off brutal crimes. During a convenience store robbery, Tuki shot and killed the 26-year-old store clerk. He also broke into a motel where he killed 3 of the family members that owned the facility. Although Tuki has denied any role in these killings, other gang members ratted him out. When Tuki was arrested, he was given the death sentence. He spent 6 years in solitary confinement. He had a bad reputation in prison, known to physically assault guards and other inmates. He began speaking out against violence and starting to write a book series called Tuki Speaks Out Against Gang Violence. His anti-violence work earned him a Nobel Peace Prize, but it wasn't enough to get him out of his situation. He was ultimately sentenced to death by lethal injection in December 2005. Raymond Washington. The last gangster on our list today is Tuki's partner in crime, Raymond Washington. He got along well with Tuki because they were both known for getting into fights. When the Crips were formed, Raymond would fight rival gang leaders and then use his influence to lure their members to his gang. This kept the Crips growing. Initially, Raymond wanted to start his own gang because he admired the Black Panthers. They were a crew that was committed to social justice, but as the gang grew, so did their brutality. The Crips ended up being more about violence than social changes. Problems were arising with the gang's growth as well. They were separated into factions, the East Side and the West Side. The violence was increasing as well, going from fistfights to combat with firearms. There were even fights within the gang. This wasn't what Raymond wanted his influence to be about. Around 1974, he was arrested for a robbery. When he was released, his influence with the Crips wasn't as strong, nor was his desire to be part of the gang. He ended up focusing more on a motorcycle gang. In 1979, Raymond was the victim of a fatal drive-by shooting. nobody has ever been arrested for this crime. This wraps up our story on the 10 most notorious black mafia figures in history. Each leader we covered today made their mark in the criminal underworld. They were able to use their entrepreneurship combined with street roughs to bring their gangs to the next level. Which of these figures do you think was the most influential? Let us know in the comments below. Thank you for sticking with us to the end. Make sure you hit like, share, and subscribe to see more Mafia Mystique content.